Sweden and Finland formally announced they want to join NATO. Will their membership make the military alliance stronger or create more of a threat for Europe? I'm Jafar Hasnan, and today's newsmaker is NATO's Nordic expansion. Both Sweden and Finland have traditionally adopted a stance of military neutrality, but after Russia's attack on Ukraine, the two Nordic nations made history and had a massive change of heart. On Sunday, the Finnish Prime Minister hailed a new era for her country as she announced it formally wanted to join NATO.
We have reached today an important decision in good cooperation between the government and the President of the Republic. We hope that the Parliament will confirm the decision to apply for NATO membership during the coming days. It will be based on a strong mandate.
A few hours later, Sweden followed suit. The ruling Social Democrats announced they were reversing their centuries-old policy to join the world's largest military alliance.
Today, the Social Democratic Party has concluded that Sweden should join NATO. Our 200-year-long standing policy of military non-alignment has served Sweden well. But the issue at hand is whether military non-alignment will keep serving as well. And Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine is not only illegal and indefensible, it also undermines the European security order that Sweden builds its security on.
But joining NATO might not be as easy as the two would like. In a moment, we will explore some of the challenges Sweden and Finland could face. But first, let's take a look at the history of the military alliance.
NATO was formed in 1949 after 12 nations signed the Washington Treaty following the Second World War. The alliance's aim was to counter Soviet influence in Europe. In its first 50 years, only 4 additional countries joined the alliance. NATO's first military action took place during the Bosnian War in 1994, when US fighter jets shot down 4 Serbian warplanes that were violating a UN-enforced no-fly zone. In 2001, NATO invoked Article 5, a treaty which states that an attack on one member is an attack on all its members. That article has only been enforced once, during the war in Afghanistan after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Today, NATO consists of 30 member states, with North Macedonia becoming the latest to join in 2020.
One nation naturally annoyed by Sweden and Finland's decision is, of course, Russia. Prior to its attack on Ukraine, the Kremlin had said it wanted guarantees Kiev would never join NATO. Now, with Helsinki and Stockholm looking to join, Moscow is far from impressed and has warned of consequences.
As my government has pointed out, this will necessitate certain military technical measures, like improving or raising the degree of defense preparations along the Finnish border.
Now, the vast majority of NATO nations have welcomed the idea of Sweden and Finland joining the alliance, but Ankara has some reservations. Ibrahim Kalin, an advisor to the Turkish government, said the door for membership was still open, but wanted the Nordic nations to end their support for the PKK terrorist group.
NATO membership is a process. There is an application process, an evaluation process, and another assessment phase among the allies. In this process, we expect this issue to be clearly resolved and brought to light with concrete steps. As these steps are taken, we will continue to evaluate the process together.
So, will NATO's Nordic expansion make the alliance stronger or create more of a threat? To discuss that, I'm joined now by Tarık Oguzlu. He is a specialist in NATO and a professor of political science and international relations at Istanbul Aydin University. William Courtney is in Washington, D.C. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Georgia and Kazakhstan and is now a senior fellow at the RAND Corporation. And from Stockholm is Jonsson, a Russian affairs analyst and author of The Russian Understanding of War. gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us here today on the Newsmakers. So currently, NATO is made up of about 30 member states. It is already considered the most powerful military alliance in the world. So tell me, Ambassador Courtney, what kind of benefit will the potential addition of two more countries, namely Finland and Sweden, could bring to the alliance? I mean, does NATO even need these two countries to become more powerful than it already is?
Sweden and Finland have been cooperating extremely closely with NATO for some years now. Equipment is largely interoperable. There have been a lot of coordination exercises with command posts and other activities. They will bring significant addition to NATO's capability to deter aggression in the north.
Okay, so if Finland and Sweden were already cooperating with NATO, then why do they need to become a member now? Tarık.
I think the question is quite clear, and the answer to that question also seems to be quite clear to me. Had Ukraine gotten nuclear weapons or any kind of weapons of mass destruction kind of facility before the invasion, maybe Russian leadership would not have dared attack Ukraine. So this seems to be the right conclusion. The Swedish and Finnish decision makers' statements seems to have come up with this latest episodes in the ongoing warfare. So nuclear war, nuclear deterrence seems to be a very important instrument in terms of having a secure and safe feeling in facing Russian nuclear or conventional attacks. So in one way or another, being a member of NATO would bring you further degree of security protection, because you will be closely cooperating with the most powerful country on earth in terms of military power capacity, that's the United States. So the European Union membership, or the so-called Nordic defense cooperation, I think compared to NATO membership would never relieve Finland and Sweden of its security needs. So membership in NATO is something much more than important than membership in the European Union or other kind of institutional relationship. So this is quite clear. This is a kind of security blanket. So you have to have it from the perspective of Finland and Sweden. We should also make it very clear that these two Nordic countries seem to be ardent supporters of the so-called Kantian or postmodern security understanding, which has been in existence in the European continent for the last 75 years. So from their own perspective, what Russia did in Ukraine is a clear violation of existing security principles and norms that seem to be quite operational in European continent for a long period of time.
Okay, Oscar, let me come to you. Many would argue that one of the reasons why Ukraine was attacked by Russia is the fact that it wanted to join NATO. Now, Sweden and Finland want to do the same. What kind of guarantees do you think NATO countries should provide Finland and Sweden that they won't end up like Ukraine?
I'm actually not that worried about the transition process, and I think that Moscow's perceived fear of a Ukraine membership was only a small part of the reason why they invaded Ukraine. I mean, one of them was that they were gradually losing control. First, they had a soft strategy up until 2014 when Yanukovych fled. Then they tried a strategy of limited war that lasted up until 2022. But for each day, they were losing influence in Ukraine up until the point the Russian leadership saw they only have the large-scale military instrument left to them. For Sweden's part, we already had key NATO member states, the US, the UK, Germany, and France, saying that they're giving bilateral security guarantees during this process. And I think especially given that such a significant amount of the Russian armed forces available are tied down in Ukraine and they cannot even fulfill the political objectives there, that doesn't worry me in terms of a military attack against Sweden and Finland.
Okay, you have made some very interesting points, Oscar. Let me put it to Ambassador Courtney. Ambassador Courtney, was NATO's expansion not a matter of concern for Russia when it comes to its attacks on Ukraine?
It was a matter of concern, but it was really only part of the issue. Recall in 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine the first time, it was not because of NATO, it was because Ukraine was going to sign an association agreement with the European Union, and that's not membership, that's far short. So I think that underlines that the main concern of Russia is that Ukraine is moving westward. And of course, that process has accelerated, as our last speaker just said, since 2014. And now a bigger Russia concern is that Belarus, after the large peaceful demonstrations against President Lukashenko over his stolen election in 2020, probably a feat in Kremlin that after the Lukashenko era of dictatorship in Belarus, that Belarus will follow Ukraine in moving westward. And so for Russia, this means that 2 out of the 3 East Slavic civilizations are no longer going to be so close to Russia, but could become part of the West.
Okay, Tarek, I will come to you, but I see, Oscar, you want to respond to Ambassador Courtney, please.
Yeah, no, I very much agree with Ambassador. I just want to flag that the week before the invasion, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, he was in Moscow and he said, I don't see NATO expansion happening within my lifetime or yours within your time of rule. So the actual Ukrainian NATO membership was not on the table. And I think there was no appetite neither from large parts of NATO. There was the Bucharest summit in 2008 when such an aspiration was expressed, but there was no NATO expansions to Ukraine on the table before this war. And I think paradoxically, this war might be the thing that brings Ukraine closer to NATO than it ever has been the last decade.
Okay. Now, certainly there will be a gray zone from the moment Sweden and Finland express their intention to join the alliance until the ratification process is completed. Tarek, what kind of risks are involved in that gray zone, in that period of time?
Actually, this is also a very important question that requires intense debates, because we should not come to the conclusion that everything will be much guaranteed from this moment onwards, because we have already noticed that Russian leadership seems to be quite against this idea, the idea of Finland joining the NATO alliance, because for a long period of time there existed a kind of security relationship, a kind of stable security relationship between Russia and these Nordic countries. And we also know that Russian leadership has never threatened the well-being and security interests of these 2 Nordic countries. And from Russian perspective, everything would be quite good if these 2 nations continue to maintain their armed neutrality policy, non-alignment kind of policy, and seeking closer bilateral cooperation with the United States or joining any kind of security initiatives with EU members. But now, with this very historic decision being already taken by these 2 northern countries, the Russians would likely pose a much greater tension, much greater risk in terms of security interests of these 2 countries, because we have already noticed that the high-level Russian decision makers have made it quite clear that we would somehow escalate the degree of tension in bordering areas through the adoption of political and military kind of instruments. But another point that I think is also quite important is the fact that not all NATO members seem to be on the same page vis-a-vis the membership of these 2 northern countries. I'm not only talking about Turkey's somehow skeptical or critical perspective, but we also know that Germany and France, the leading heavyweights within NATO and the engine countries of the European Union organization, have already made clear that their bilateral relationship with Russia really matters. So they don't want to antagonize Russia further to the corner, and making sure that this NATO enlargement towards Finland and Sweden antagonize the Russians and pave the way for further escalation of crisis, or maybe culminating with the use of tactical nuclear weapons on the part of the Russians. So don't forget the fact that French and Germans are not as adamant as Americans in terms of having Finland and Sweden inside NATO.
Okay, we are going to talk about Turkey's concerns in a moment, but Ambassador Courtney, let me come to you here. As I understand, in the foreseeable future, Europe will be divided between 2. On the one hand, you have Russia, and on the other hand, you have some 40 European countries.
So it's not really a division that is caused by, for example, the expansion of NATO, since Sweden and Finland are so close to NATO as it is already. The real division is caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, by Russia's using military force against another European country. This is the first time since the Battle of Berlin in 1945 that such a large-scale aggression has occurred in Europe. And so it is Russia's actions that have really caused the division in Europe. But all the rest of Europe is pretty well united in opposed to that division, to that aggression.
So are you indicating that Sweden and Finland's potential membership into NATO is going to help unite Europe even more than it is already right now?
Well, again, it is Russia's aggression in Ukraine that has helped unite Europe even more. And Sweden and Finland's joining NATO is kind of a consequence of that Russian aggression. Had it not taken place, Sweden and Finland may not have perceived the threat to be so great, but it has taken place, and it's caused a number of NATO members to decide to increase defense spending, especially Germany. It has caused a number of NATO countries to provide military support to Ukraine as a victim of aggression, which they had never planned to do before.
Okay, Oscar, over the past 2 to 3 months, Russian attacks on Ukraine have produced many unintended consequences. Finland, and many would argue Finland and Sweden's desire to join NATO is one of them. Tell me, how confident are you that in the future Russia is not going to attack these countries if they become a member of NATO?
Well, I mean, you can just look at the empirics. Russia has invaded 0 countries that are members of NATO. But I have to also comment on what was said before, that no provocative activity has been coming from Russia to Finland and Sweden. That is not the reality we share on the ground here. Rather, we've seen more than a decade of provocations, including military provocations from fighter jets, including submarines, but also different types of subversion and very active Russian espionage and information warfare efforts. So rather, the last decade has been characterized by Russian hostile activity. And I think this invasion is what ultimately drove the decision to apply for membership in NATO. And I agree very much with what the ambassador said.
But Oscar, if I may interject here, Finland shares a border of about 1,300 kilometers with Russia. And the Russians have already said that if Finland becomes a member of NATO, they see it as a provocation. So
absolutely. I mean, one could argue that invading Ukraine is a provocation as well. But let's look at Finland. Finland has the 2nd largest artillery in Europe. They could probably put up as good a fight as Ukraine has. They have a mobilization force that can get a couple of 100,000 men in arms in no time. So I'm not that worried about it. And Russia right now, they cannot even get a decisive victory in eastern Ukraine. So they can threaten all they want about building up military infrastructure on the eastern border. But yet again, Russia has invaded 0 NATO members. So I'm not that worried about it. And I do think that NATO is the best deterrent against Russian aggression.
So as I understand, it's highly unlikely for Russia to take any actions against Finland and Sweden's NATO membership. Tarık?
No, I disagree. I think that wasn't for me. No, I think they will take an action, but I don't think it will be military. Sorry for jumping the queue.
Okay, Tarık. Oscar, I'll come back to you. Tarık, please. Go ahead.
Let me tell you that before this latest Ukrainian invasion, we had not discussed any time in the recent past the kind of relationship between Russia on the one hand and Sweden and Finland on the other hand. The people all around the globe were totally unaware of any kind of friction, any kind of crisis, any kind of problem between Russians and these 2 Nordic countries. So these bilateral relationships were not on the agenda. Russians are quite fixed with the future status of Ukraine, but they have not made it very clear that they would be somehow very much against the security and safety of Finnish people and Swedish people. So as far as I know, as an IR scholar, I don't remember any recent past in which we had discussed the kind of relationship between Russians and Finnish people, the Russians and the Swedish people to a greater extent, to a significant degree. But in the latest months after the Ukrainian invasion, this issue somehow came to the fore. And we should also not forget the fact that we should approach this problem also from the perspective of NATO itself, rather than these two Nordic countries. I think NATO as an institution and the United States as the most powerful country of NATO membership, NATO as an institution seems to get the highest degree of benefit from this eventuality, Finland and Sweden becoming a member of the NATO. This should be seen as a part of American strategy to put further sanctions and penalties in one way or another on the Russian leadership. So this is a kind of a part of the strategy sanctioning Russia. I think we should also approach this problem from this perspective. It is the Americans, I think, are somehow pushing these two Northern countries to join NATO, rather than the two nations coming to the conclusion that we have to do it. Because if you might remember, before the invasion of Ukraine, the majorities in these two nations were quite against this particular eventuality. They were quite happy to see that their armed neutrality and their non-aligned status in global politics had benefited them to a significant extent.
Okay,
we should also make. We should also
Tarık, we do have an American on the panel, Ambassador Courtney. Is it the U.S. which is pushing Finland and Sweden to become a member of NATO?
I don't think it is the U.S. or other European countries. Sweden and Finland have had their own positions for a long period of time, and they are now making the decision. They have taken the initiative on their own. It's actually a surprise to some extent how quickly and how decisively Finland and Sweden have moved to join NATO, to seek to join NATO. I think the rest of the alliance will be pleased that they join. The contribution that Sweden and Finland will make to the defense of the North will be quite considerable. And so the benefit to the alliance will be a more secure North. And that's
Ambassador Courtney, but does NATO as an organization, as an alliance, really need that contribution from Finland and Sweden right now?
Prior to the latest invasion of Ukraine, there were perceptions that Russia's willingness to use large-scale military force in Europe, that willingness was not so great as people see it now. It's the scale of aggression in Ukraine that has shocked Europe and shocked NATO. And so I think that is the singular activity which has added to the decade of or more of frustration in Sweden and Finland of the various other activities of submarines and fighter aircraft and things like that.
Okay, we are in the dying minutes of the program. I really want to discuss Ankara's concerns about Sweden's and Finland's potential NATO membership. Tarık, Ankara has made it very clear that it does not want to block Sweden and Finland from becoming a member of NATO, but rather address the issue of terror elements which are present in their countries, the PKK terrorist group. So how do you think Finland and Sweden should address this problem?
Really, this is a very important question. And also, I'm totally on the same page with you regarding Turkey's position on this latest crisis. So in the final analysis, I am of the view that Turkey would say yes to membership of these two countries, despite the fact that we have been experiencing some real crisis with these two countries, just because of the fact that, as you have already pointed out, Turkish decision makers perceive that these two nations have been somehow supporting this PKK or YPG terrorist organizations in one way or another. So we have to approach this problem from the perspective of somehow transactional relationship, a kind of bargaining process between Turkey on the one hand and NATO as an institution and these two prospective members as countries on the other hand. But I have already noticed that high-level Swedish and Finnish decision makers will pay visits to Turkey in the near future. So they will have extensive talks in capital city Ankara. So I'm sure that they will find a modus vivendi, a face-saving solution. I'm totally optimistic on this part.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here today on The Newsmakers. And thank you for watching. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Jafar Hasnan. See you next time.